If you ache for truth, goodness, and beauty, if you're hungry for a Christianity with substance and strength, if you long for a faith that's big and bold and biblical and all about Jesus Christ, if you're inspired by the idea of one church that has spanned 20 centuries, 24 time zones, and 2 hemispheres, enfolding every race, nation, and language, then you're considering Catholicism. You know, on a regular basis, somebody will say to me, I love the Catholic faith. I love the Eucharist. I love the saints. I love the continuity of tradition. I love the history, the truth, the goodness, the beauty, the art, the intellectual depth, the whole thing. All of it draws me in. And I'm excited about Catholicism. And this will come either from Catholics themselves or those who are considering Catholicism. But they'll say, when the bishops or the Vatican or the Pope wades into political positions, not necessarily just moral positions or a moral vision, but wades into specific politics. And that might be, say, on climate policy, wading into the carbon emissions or what governments should do for immigration. And understanding that the Catechism says that countries have a right to regulate their borders, but people have a right to migrate. But then the bishops or the Pope wades into making specific political positions or statements about this or that country's policies on that. Or Ukraine. Somebody will say to me, the Vatican supports the war in the Ukraine and wants Europeans to step up and Americans to get more involved. But it was 5 minutes ago they were saying that weapons manufacturers and making weapons was the worst thing in the world, except when it's the Ukraine, and then we have to do it and, whatever. Or the deal with China. The Vatican has made diplomatic arrangements with China. And so China ends up getting a pass on climate policies or their fishing fleets stripping the seas or human rights abuses. It doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter which side of those issues that somebody was on, because half the emails or comments I get come from folks who think that the bishops or the Vatican or the Pope is too conservative, and the other half think that they're too progressive. So whichever side they come down, half the people are going to be unhappy about it. But the common thread is the same, that this feels like it's going beyond doctrine and morals. This feels like the bishops or the Vatican or the Pope are wading into politics. So they'll say, do I have to agree with everything that the Pope says on these prudential political matters to stay in good standing as a Catholic? Or if I become Catholic, am I going to have to toe the line or accept all of the political positions that Bishop so-and-so or the Bishops' Conference or the Vatican Diplomatic Corps or the Pope articulates? Can I be Catholic and still disagree with the Pope or the Vatican Diplomatic Corps or, the Bishops' Conference? And the short answer is that you don't have to agree with everything that the Pope says or the Vatican says or the bishops say on prudential political matters. And the Church's own teaching backs that up. The Catechism tells us that we owe religious submission of intellect and will to definitive teaching on faith and morals. But on contingent prudential questions. So, we agree that we have a responsibility to be stewards of creation. That may be a matter of faith and morals. But how best are we to do that? Which climate treaties or policies should be used to pursue that? Or we agree that there's a human right to migration. We also agree that nations have a right to enforce their borders. That's the position of the Church articulated in the Catechism and other places. But the specifics of that, which nation, how should this nation protect its borders? What's due process involve? The same thing with the Ukraine and Or to preserve the underground Christians in China, we have to accept the Chinese communist government's positions on everything else, or shut up about them. So what I'm trying to say is that faithful Catholics, and I think this is what the Catechism says, what the Church says, is that faithful Catholics can reach different conclusions from each other. And sometimes those conclusions put us in tension with a position coming out of the Vatican or from bishops' conferences. And sometimes that tension feels like it conflicts with our duty as citizens to the common good of our own patria or patria. That's an old word that St. Thomas Aquinas uses for your homeland, your fatherland. Patria, like, the father. That's where we get the word patriotism. And St. Thomas Aquinas and the Church has always said that we do owe a duty and a loyalty under subsidiarity to our homeland and to our homes and to our communities, that we have a civic obligation to love and serve our neighbors. So what do we do when our conscience or our reason or our duty or love of country seems to pull us in one direction and the Vatican's diplomatic stance pulls in another direction? And look, this has happened before. In fact, it's happened a lot in church history. So over the next 3 episodes, this one and the next 2, I'm going to look at a couple of historical moments when faithful Orthodox Catholics found themselves on the quote-unquote wrong side, politically speaking, of powerful churchmen, bishops, cardinals, or even the popes, alliances and political positions. And we'll watch how, in a few of these instances, these folks who found themselves on the opposite side of the Vatican or the bishops or the Pope in these political conflicts, how those Catholics, stayed in communion with the church, how they received the sacraments, how they defended the faith, and yet still followed their conscience for the good of their patria, their homeland, their civic responsibilities. So, to set the stage, we're going to start with a 150-year-long crisis in medieval Italy that you have almost certainly never heard of. In fact, of the 25,000 people that are going to listen to this month, I'd be shocked if 25 of you have heard of this. But for 150 years in medieval Italy, there was a conflict that feels, when you understand it, strangely familiar to us today, or would be familiar to us today. It is the conflict between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. And when the popes threw their weight behind one political party, behind one rising superpower on the European continent, and ordinary Catholics in their hometowns, in their city-states, found themselves on the opposite side of these papal alliances and ended up paying a very high price. So let me dive into that, this conflict from medieval Italy between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. And I want you to understand this as a kind of a historical analogy for how some of us might feel today. I'm not saying necessarily me, I'm not saying you, but how some of us might feel wherever we stand in our political conflicts. And then in the next episode, I'm going to give an example of a very, very, very famous Catholic, lauded by popes and held up in Catholic history as one of the greats of Catholic accomplishment. And in the third episode of this little mini-series, I'm going to give another example of a 100-year conflict in Europe during the Middle Ages in which faithful Catholics found themselves on either side, and someone who became a saint found themselves paying a price for being on the wrong side, at least for a while. So I'm not going to dive into specific conflicts today. This is one of those situations where you say, he who has ears, let him hear. Because if you hear in these examples anything that is useful to you, that helps frame your understanding and your experience of where you stand today on either side of various political conflicts, and then watching where the church leaders come down, hopefully this is helpful for you to see that this is not the first time that Catholics have found themselves in these kinds of quandaries. So let's dive into this conflict in medieval Italy. The year is 1200, What you have to remember is that Italy was not a country like we think of it. It was a peninsula. It was a place in the same way that Central America is not a country. It's an isthmus or whatever you call it. Italy is a peninsula full of fiercely independent city republics. So there is no federal nation. There are all these independent little countries, city-states. So you have Florence and Siena and Pisa and Lucca and Perugia and Assisi and Bologna and Milan and Verona. And each one is like a little Athens or a little Sparta. It has its walls and it has its guilds and it has its elected councils. And each one makes its own coins and has its own militia citizen army. And these little city-states fight each other constantly. But the fights are small compared to what we would think of as modern armies and whatnot. They're almost ritual. You have a few hundred citizen militia knights on each side. They do a little siege or two. They have a little battle. People get captured. They ransom the prisoners back to their home city. And then they're always done by fall because everyone needs to get back for the harvest. But above all of these little Italian city-states, there are these two political giants. The one is the Holy Roman Emperor, who still claims to be the legitimate secular heir of Caesar and Charlemagne. And the other political giant is the Pope in Rome, who claims to be the vicar of Christ and therefore the man who gets to say whether the emperor's crown is legitimate. And for a long time, the arrangement is tense and it's uneasy, but it's workable and they get by. Emperors come south over the Alps every generation or two. They get crowned in St. Peter's Basilica. They collect some tribute. They go home with their army. The city-states end up playing both sides. They pay whoever is stronger during that decade. They make alliances and promises and shift their alliances all the time. And life goes on. It's sort of the way things are done in medieval Italy. But then arrives the most brilliant, terrifying ruler of the 13th century, Frederick II Hohenstaufen. He was Holy Roman Emperor from 1220 to 1250. He also held the crown of Sicily. He was fluent in 6 languages. He was a friend of Muslim scholars. He kept leopards and giraffes in his own private zoo. And he was a man who ran his kingdom in Sicily like an oriental despot. Direct taxation, royal bureaucracy, a standing army paid in cash, no feudal middlemen. And the popes in Rome look south at Frederick's Sicily and they gulp because they think they see the future of Italy. And they panic because that future has no room for an independent papal state sitting in the middle of the Italian boot, peninsula. So beginning with Pope Innocent IV in 1245, the papacy makes a cold, calculating, 150-year strategic bet. The popes essentially say, we are no longer putting our money on the old, decentralized Germanic Holy Roman Empire. We're going to switch horses. The future of Western Europe belongs to centralized, bureaucratic, royal France. And we're going to help France become the dominant power in Christendom, if that's what it takes to keep the emperor from swallowing up central Italy and making the Pope basically his court chaplain. Because France at this exact moment is becoming the first true nation state. It has this huge population. It has royal judges riding circuit. It has a treasury that collects taxes in coin instead of in chickens, barter goods. And it has a pious Catholic king, Louis IX, who would actually eventually be known as Saint Louis, where we get St. Louis. And eventually St. Louis is happy to be the Pope's protector, his strong right arm. So that when the Pope gets afraid of Frederick II up in Vienna, swallowing up central Italy, St. Louis is happy to say, well, not on my watch. I've got armies and power, and I can protect the Pope. So from 1245 onward, the papal playbook becomes brutally consistent. The popes excommunicate the emperor. Frederick II gets excommunicated count it, 4 times. The popes declare Frederick II's supporters to be heretics. The popes preach crusades, actual crusades with indulgences against Italian cities that stay loyal to the empire. And the popes invite French princes south with papal money and papal blessing to, quote, restore order in Italy. So these French princes come down with armies, backed by the Pope, with a blank check from the Pope, and papal financial support. So 1266 becomes the turning point, because Pope Clement IV literally signs a treaty with Charles of Anjou, younger brother of King Louis IX. And the Pope says to Charles of Anjou, "You come conquer the kingdom of Sicily for us, and we will crown you king in St. Peter's." So Charles marches south with a French army. He annihilates the last Hohenstaufen at the Battle of Benevento, and he is crowned in Rome while the papal choir sings Te Deum. And all of a sudden, southern Italy, which had been happily Catholic for 600 years, wakes up one morning governed by French officials speaking a foreign language and taxing them to pay for French armies to fight French wars. Fast forward 35 years to 1301. Same playbook, different city. Pope Boniface VIII wants Florence firmly under papal control. Florence says, no thank you. Boniface invites another French prince, this time Charles of Valois, brother of King Philip IV, to come, quote, pacify the region of Tuscany, where Florence and Siena are. So Charles of Valois marches in under papal banners and the pro-papal Black Guelph political faction. So the Guelphs are a political party, and the Black Guelphs are a subset of that political party. And the Black Guelph faction throws open the gates of Florence, and the leaders of the more moderate White Guelph party, including someone who was a devout lay Catholic, a daily communicant, went to Mass every day, took the Eucharist, and he was the future author of the greatest Catholic poem ever written. And he and the other White Guelph leaders are sentenced to be burned alive if they ever return. And that layman's name, of course, is Dante Alighieri, who wrote the Divine Comedy. And then, just to make the picture complete, 8 years later in 1309, the Pope physically picks up the entire papal court, lock, stock, and treasury, all the cardinals, all the bishops, all of the page boys, all the stuff, and he moves the entire papal court from Rome to southern France, a city called Avignon, for 70 years. So the papal court is no longer in Rome, it's in southern France, in Avignon. 7 consecutive French popes, a college of cardinals that is 90% French, a papal palace in Avignon paid for by taxes, squeezed out of Italian dioceses to pay for the French palace of the popes. And Italians start calling the years 1309 to 1377 the Babylonian captivity of the church. And they're not wrong. I literally could not do this without you, because this show is 100% listener supported. There are no ads, no sponsors. So if the episodes are helping you to understand the faith, to answer your questions, or draw you closer to historic Catholic Christianity, would you consider becoming a patron? For as little as $5 a month, you'll get every regular episode organized into topical playlists, plus exclusive bonus content, extra conversations, video Q&As, deep dives, live streams, behind the scenes, and more. Just head to patreon.com/considering Catholicism or tap the link in the show notes. Together, we're educating, equipping, and exciting people about the beauty of the Catholic faith. Now, let's pause and feel what the average Catholic on the ground felt. You're a wool merchant in Florence or a vintner in Siena. You go to Mass every Sunday, you pay your tithes, you want your children baptized and confirmed and married in the church. And you also love your city, your patria, the way an American today might love his state or his hometown. And you've governed yourselves in that city for 200 years. Your tradesmen's guilds run the hospitals, the orphanages, the city walls. And suddenly the Pope tells you that your city's traditional liberties are now, quote, obstacles to the peace of Christendom, and that you must accept French governors, French taxes, and French military garrisons in your city because the Pope has decided France is the eldest daughter of the Church and the only power that can protect the papacy. So what do? Well, some Catholics, the Black Guelphs, say, look, the Pope is Peter. Whatever he says is God's will. Other Catholics, the White Guelphs, and many Ghibellines, the other political party, say, we love Peter, but we will not let Peter hand our city over to a foreign superpower. And here's the part we have to hold in tension. The popes were not cartoon villains, right? I mean, in the Reformation, you get this, and from Protestants ever since, the medieval popes were, goofy, wily, coyote cartoon villains. But that's not true. You have to find your way mentally into their world. They were genuinely terrified of being swallowed up by a revived Roman Empire being run out of Vienna. And they looked at Frederick II's Sicily, which was a part of that empire, and they saw what a real imperial bureaucracy could do to a city and do to a country, and how you would have no liberties left. And the popes believed, with some good reason, that a strong French alliance was the only way to keep the church free so that she could do her spiritual mission. But the cost of that alliance with France was the destruction of the ancient communal liberties and freedom of the Italian city-states, and the impoverishment of central Italy through endless taxation. And ordinary faithful Catholics in places like Florence and Assisi and Perugia and Siena and Pisa and all these cities were caught in the middle. And even the young Francis of Assisi, before he heard the crucifix in, the chapel of San Damiano say, Francis, rebuild my church, wrote out in 1302 under the Guelph banner because he loved Assisi, his home city. He was a patriot for his home city, and he wanted to defend his home city, his patria, against Perugia, because Perugia was part of the Ghibelline political party, not the Guelph political party. Everybody's a faithful Catholic, but you've got different political parties all aligned around the various alliances with Frederick II and the Holy Roman Empire versus the kings of France. And the Perugians who captured him weren't devils. They were faithful Catholics defending their own city. There were no clean jerseys in this fight. Everyone was a faithful Catholic. Everyone loved the Lord. Everyone loved the church. Everyone took the sacraments. But it came down to your city-state, your freedoms, your loyalties, and these alliances with these superpowers in Vienna or Paris, and where the popes stood in those alliances, and you got caught on one side or the other. And that described these political parties, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, and even sub-parties within them like the Black Guelphs and the White Guelphs. It was a complicated mess, and the ordinary Catholic said, well, what am I supposed to do? My loyalties are divided, my conscience is divided. Who am I supposed to follow here? Do I follow the popes unquestionably, even if they move to southern France for 70 years and are run by a French king? Or do I, remain loyal to my city, even if that means that we're on the opposite side of the Pope and supporting the Holy Roman Emperor? So look, next week in part 2, we're going to sit at the feet of one lay Catholic who lived through the worst of it. I mentioned him earlier, Dante Alighieri. And watch how he stayed 100% Catholic. He kept receiving the sacraments until the day he died. He was a lay Franciscan and was buried in a Franciscan habit. And he defended the spiritual primacy of the papacy until his last breath. And yet, in his epic poem, The Divine Comedy, he still put 3 popes in hell for selling out Italy to foreign powers. And the reason I'm sharing that, and I want to share his story in the next episode, is because if Dante could thread that political needle, all these complicated politics, and still remain a faithful Catholic, if he could do that in 1302, then maybe there's a way for each of us to thread that needle and remain faithful Catholics even when politics divides us. So join me for part 2 and see how perhaps the greatest literary figure in Catholic history managed to navigate this both successfully and unsuccessfully in his own life. We'll be back with another episode very soon. And this show is 100% listener supported. My patrons keep the lights on, and they let me spend more time researching and recording so that these episodes keep coming. If this show has helped you, would you consider becoming a patron? For as little as $5 a month, you'll get every regular episode organized into topical playlists, plus exclusive bonus content, extra video Q&As, deep dive courses, live streams, and more. Just head to patreon.com/considering Catholicism or tap the link in the show notes. And would you please rate the podcast on whatever platform you're using and write a review on Apple Podcasts or on consideringcatholicism.com. And you can drop me a line. Patrons can comment directly on Patreon posts or Spotify. I read every one. Or you can always use the contact form at consideringcatholicism.com, or you can email me at consideringcatholicism@gmail.com. I love hearing your questions, your comments, and your stories.